think about where your gut is. It is literally in the center of your body. It's an engine for everything, right? And it feeds your brain and your heart and your kidneys and your lungs. And the same way, if your car had a broken down engine, you're not going to get very far. You know, I think what I have to offer is a little different. It's some storytelling from the gut, making it exciting. The first one is an episode called Shy Bowel. And so they all kind of start with a patient story. And this talks about this woman who came to see me in her 50s, but when she was 12, she was at camp and she was on a long hike and had to poo and she squatted down. And these boy hikers, the campers, found her like mid-exit. The stool is exiting her bum, right? And these group of boys happen upon her in the woods, and how it created such trauma. She could never have normal bowel movements. And the actual term for shy bowel, that this is a real condition, psychogenic fecal retention, also called coprophagia, and how so many people have an element of it where they're afraid to use a bathroom in public. They're afraid people will see, will smell, will hear. And then, you know, I talk about like the involuntary and the voluntary things that go into having a bowel movement. And like, so I start each one with the story, get into it, I talk a little bit about the mechanism, and then I end with 3 takeaways. And like, takeaway 1, drop it while it's hot. Like, you have got, when you get that urge, like, you know, you could be mid, you know, love making, like you've got to go and have a bowel movement. And so I gave like, so it's a little bit of a format. It's a patient story. It's a, you know, get into the nitty gritty, and then 3 takeaways, and they're all like 20 minutes or less. And so it's fun to just, you know, after trying all these different things, and because I'm sure, as you know, Shawn, your podcast is really only as good as a person you're interviewing to a large extent. I mean, you're a really skilled interviewer. You can bring it out and you prepare, but a lot of it rides on that other person, right?
That's
and
so
I
powerful.
thought, you know, I have some stories from the gut. The intro is like, if you're on a quest for stool nirvana and you're more interested in learning about microbes and medication, you've come to the right place, you know, and it's just been fun. At the end of the day, it's, you know, like, what do I have to lose? I love doing it, but I have to stop re-recording, and just, that's really good advice. Like, just let it out there.
Yes, just literally drop it while it's hot. You know, like, you got to take their own advice for getting that out into the world.
I have to drop it while it's hot.
You know, because your information is the
I love how we stool pun.
You can use that.
I'm going to use that. My
Listen.
information is the literally.
Yes, literally. And, you know, your experience, your perspective, I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. You are one of the, for me, top 3 people in the world in this space, because of course you have that traditional background in education, but you've been able to keep your mind open and to experiment and to stay on top of the research. And I know how difficult that is, because there's always so much coming out, but we can get stuck in tunnel vision coming from our conventional education and just see things in this one very, very constricted, again, another little tie into the digestion here, a very constrictive view of things and how the human body works. But being an integrative gastroenterologist, I want you, number one, if you could explain what that is, because it's opening the door to understand just how much our gut health affects everything about us.
To be honest, Shawn, it's a term I made up to really emphasize the connection between it all. Because when you think about it, think about where your gut is. It is literally in the center of your body. It's an engine for everything, right? And it feeds your brain and your heart and your kidneys and your lungs. And the same way, if your car had a broken down engine, you're not going to get very far. You know, if your alignment is off, or something's up with the transmission, or your lights don't work, you can still make it down the road. But if the engine is not working, you're not going anywhere. And so this idea of integration, you know, in medical school, we're very siloed. There's the brain, and there's the digestive tract, and there's a cardiovascular system, and the, you know, the orthopedic system with the muscles and the joints and so on. And there's literally no integration. And in my 30 years in practice, I realized there's tremendous integration, particularly with things like the gut-brain axis and mood. And so I started seeing literally what would happen to my patient's mood after they had, for example, an episode of infectious gastroenteritis. And they would describe they're feeling more anxious and they're feeling more nervous. And then we started seeing clinical data of like, wow, when we inject mice with Campylobacter and give them gastroenteritis, guess what? They start displaying more anxiety. So as we've learned more about the whole gut-brain axis, the production of serotonin, the communication through the vagus nerve, the fact that it's bidirectional. Not only is what's going on in your gut affecting your brain, what's going on in your brain is affecting your gut. It just makes sense. Like, you cannot practice gastroenterology in a vacuum. Or maybe you can, but then you're just scoping people and, handing out Nexium. And you're not really having an impact. So it's really important to understand the integration. And just from an ego point of view, in medical school, nobody wanted to do GI. Back when I was in medical school, everybody wanted to do orthopedics or dermatology or ophthalmology. I mean, people were like, why would you want to wade around in stool as your profession? So I have to say, the gut is having a big moment, and I am so excited about that. I'm like, I told you all that the gut was where it's at.
So also you have this, ability to see the future in a sense, because like when you just said the gut is having a moment, I just spoke at an event this past weekend in Mexico and just asked people in the audience if they've just heard the term microbiome. Every hand went up. Everybody knows this term. They might not know all the ins and outs of it for the most part, but this is where you come in at and why your skill set and your experience is so valuable. And this is leading into the main reason I wanted to talk to you today is this gut cognition connection, this gut-brain connection, because there's some new data that just came out about antibiotic use and cognitive decline. Let's talk about that.
Shawn, this study literally stopped me in my tracks. This was a study that came out in March that looked at frequent antibiotic use in women and noted a significant decrease in global cognitive decline. So they looked at over 14,000 women. These were female nurses over a period of several years. And they found that women who were taking antibiotics frequently, and when they added it all up, it was for about 2 months or more over a 4-year period, had a 7-point drop in cognitive decline globally. Now, what does a 7-point drop mean? It turns out that's equivalent to about 3 to 4 years of aging. It's incredible, right? And so many of us are dealing with issues of family histories of dementia and, concern about cognitive loss. And I don't think that the average person, I don't think the average physician, quite frankly, is aware of these kinds of statistics. And so one of the things that I'm most evangelical about, if you will, is getting people to understand this connection between the medications they take and the effects on their bodies and their brains. Nothing is free. Not even a prenatal vitamin is free. Everything has side effects. And we know that antibiotics are amongst the most overprescribed drugs in the world. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that somewhere around 30 to 50% of antibiotic use in the US is unnecessary. So, people always want to know. I gave a talk yesterday at a women's club and everybody wanted to know what probiotic. I said, draw the brakes for a minute. I don't want to talk to you about what probiotic. I want to talk to you about all those antibiotics you're taking that you probably don't need. And my patients, it's sort of a joke, but not really, where I say to my patients, if death is imminent, you have my blessing. Otherwise, here are some questions I want to ask your doctor who's doing the prescribing, starting with, is this antibiotic absolutely necessary? Is there an alternative? What would happen if I didn't take it? Could we wait? Am I even being treated for an infection? Or are you just giving me this antibiotic to prevent a possible infection? All these things. And I think, unfortunately, Shawn, we're at this point in the medical system where we can't just blindly follow advice. We have to ask these probing questions if we really want to, get to the right place. And we have to be really active advocates in our health and not just rely on the fact that, well, the doctor said, so this must be the way to go.
Yeah. Here in the United States especially, you're like a unicorn if you haven't had several stints of antibiotic treatment, especially during childhood. Like, it's just one of those things that's automatic and frequent. And as you said, and I want to lean into this a little bit more because so often it's getting prescribed for things that it's not even valid for. And I think that there might be, there is, of course, a placebo effect, for example, or things just run their course. But to prescribe antibiotics for viral infection, for example, like even when COVID landed on the scene, antibiotics were getting passed out. And there's some really sound data on this, that this thing was just getting, again, without any context. This is viral. What are we doing giving antibiotics for this condition?
Yeah, I think that's really kind of the salient point of the last 2 years. Antibiotics have zero effect against viruses, zero, zip, zilch, nada, none. The only situation where an antibiotic can be helpful in the setting of a viral infection is if you have what's called bacterial superinfection, meaning you also have a bacterial infection. And get this, Shawn, this is the crazy part. Who is at most risk for bacterial superinfection? People who've been taking lots of antibiotics and don't have enough bacterial foot soldiers to fight the virus. So the irony is that all these antibiotics people are taking, and honestly, I see sophisticated, well-educated people, and when I tell them, that doxycycline your kid is taking for acne or that Cipro you're taking for a sinus infection, do you know that that is dramatically increasing your risk of COVID? They look at me in utter surprise. And I think what it speaks to is really the power that the pharmaceutical industry has in terms of the marketing dollars. I mean, the money that is spent trying to convince people that these drugs are the answer and the only answer. And we've become so disconnected from our own bodies and our own strength, our own ability to fight these things. And I have to tell you, that's why I am really such a fan of your show, because it really, the goal, the mission is always to educate and empower people to say, you know what, you are actually in the driver's seat here. And that's so true when it comes to infection. And, you let me know when you're ready to drill down to that whole gut immune connection and how it works, because I think once people really understand the relationship, it becomes so clear. The path forward becomes so clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll put also up these studies as we go stuff. If
Great.
People are watching the video version as we go through things today, you could check out the studies. But one of them that I talked about, and this was over a year ago, was this huge meta-analysis looking at this phenomenon of something called polypharmacy, dramatically increasing your risk of severe COVID. So polypharmacy is being on multiple medications. And they identified 3 specific types of medications that were tending to be the most pervasive and the most damaging. One of those was related to gut. So the gut medications, so things that are acid blockers, for example, and antibiotics. Why on earth would these be increasing your risk for severe COVID? And one of the things they highlighted in the study was that COVID is at least in part an enteric infection, a gut-related infection, because we know there's a lot of ACE2 receptors happening. And also, of course, your immune system in and of itself is hanging out primarily in that gut environment. So super powerful stuff there.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head 3 times. Bam, bam, bam. The first is pointing out that COVID is in many ways a gut infection. In fact, we have about 100 times more ACE2 receptors in our intestines than we have in our lungs. So the portal of entry is often the gut. And that's why GI symptoms in some of the studies are present in up to 50% of people. And we know the virus is excreted in the stool, sometimes for much longer than it's detectable in the sputum. So that was nail number 1. Nail number 2 was talking about the acid blockers, proton pump inhibitors specifically. And I think I was on here doing a long rant about these drugs in the past, because this is just one of my favorite things to talk about, because you literally cannot leave a gastroenterologist's office, except mine, of course, without a prescription for one of these drugs. I spend my time unprescribing people, but these drugs are amongst the most commonly prescribed drugs in the world. And part of why they're prescribed so commonly is because they work really well. They're really good at what they do. And what they do is they completely shut off that proton pump, that acid pump in the stomach. So now you can eat your cheeseburger at 11 o'clock and you can have your 3 cocktails and you can have your 4 cups of espresso and you're feeling good, right? You're like, this is fantastic. The problem is those symptoms, that heartburn that you get when you have your, late night cheeseburger and your 4 cups of espresso and your cocktails, That feedback is really the negative feedback your body's giving you to tell you, this is not a good idea. So when you remove that, you are actually doing damage. And that's what proton pump inhibitors do. When they block the acid, you don't have symptoms, but those symptoms are really important because it's your body signaling you. It's like pain when you overdo it at the gym, or a hangover when you drink too much. I mean, I'm always saying, man, if we didn't have hangovers, I mean, millions of people would be dying from alcohol poisoning because people would just keep going, right? So that hangover is your body's brakes. And so what happens, not only do these drugs remove the brakes, they do something far more problematic in the gut, which is they completely shut down acid production. And acid is digestion 101. You cannot properly break down the food and assimilate the nutrients into your body without acid. The digestive enzymes don't work at an alkaline pH. So that's one problem. Huge problem now with the pandemic. And in addition to the study you're talking about, which is a super important study, there was a big meta-analysis that came out summer of 2020, looking at about 54,000 patients. And they found people taking proton pump inhibitors once a day, twice as likely to get COVID. People taking them twice a day, 3 to 4 times as likely to get COVID, for the simple reason that stomach acid denatures viral protein. It basically renders the virus inactive if you have stomach acid. So you're happily taking your, little purple pill and eating your cheeseburger late at night and having no symptoms and thinking this is great, not realizing that you have just dismantled one of your body's most potent defense mechanisms against viruses. You have just made yourself so vulnerable. And part of the reason that I love putting this together for people and making sure they understand the connection is that, number one, it's empowering, right? Like, now you can understand how to protect yourself. But number two, people don't know, because your doctor gives you this drug. Your doctor is not telling you, by the way, stomach acid is one of your most important host defenses in fighting viruses, and you're not going to have any stomach acid. So not only are you not going to be able to properly digest your food, but you're now going to be much more vulnerable to viruses. And, I have these discussions with my husband at the dinner table all the time. He's not in medicine. He's an ex-federal agent who does cybersecurity. So he's kind of my litmus test. And I tell him this stuff, and I'm like, you know that, right? And he's like, Robynne, people don't know that. Like, I don't know that. How would I know that? How would you intuitively know that not having stomach acid puts you at risk for COVID? So, for me, like, realizing like people don't know this stuff has really been the main motivation to write these books and get the word out there, and, be on shows like yours that with the same goal of, we've got to let people know what is happening when they take these drugs.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest thing that has not been addressed this entire time, which is susceptibility, and what you can do to dramatically reduce your susceptibility. Again, it puts the power into people's hands. That's the whole concept behind empowerment.
Power to the people.
Exactly. And what we've been doing is just creating a psychology of victimization for people. Like, I've never seen people in such a victim state as we have the past couple of years. And then that starts to bleed into other things. But also, I'm grateful because I can see how quickly we can devolve into that type of thinking. And in leaning into this a little bit more with this susceptibility, I love the fact that, and I'm so grateful, you're one of the people who really like brought this front of mind for me, which is that biological feedback that we get, right? And so when we are invoking these behaviors, and for me, the thing that stands out the most was I had this rendezvous, I had this little intimate occasion where I would go and get this 7-Eleven nacho with chili and cheese, right? And so just psychologically, I didn't realize that it's probably not a good idea to be at this convenience store pumping your meat out of a pump, right? So you're pushing, right? Meat's coming out of this pump.
Oh, the meat comes out of the pump, not the cheese?
The meat, the cheese too. They were right next to each other, right? And so you get the nachos, you pump your meat out, you pump your cheese out. And so, but I would love the taste and how the chips get a little bit soggy. And so I would take this back to my apartment and have this, this love connection. But every time I would be in pain afterwards.
You would feel it, yeah.
Yes, and my body's telling me, don't eat this. Don't eat this. This is not for you. But what I would do is, because one time I called my mom, I was like, Mom, like I just had this 7-Eleven nacho. She was like, just drink a white soda. Right?
That's the
So
one
now,
time where mom did not know best.
no, right. She did not know best. And so now after that, I just started getting my nacho with chili cheese and I get a 7-Up with it, right? And still, again, I'm trying to find a way to suppress the symptom. My body's saying, do not eat this. This is not for you. And so being able to tune in and listen to that feedback. So the suffering that we get, we've been programmed in our culture to look for a drug or some type of treatment for the thing instead of stop doing the behavior.
Yes, and then you get into the whole polypharmacy thing you're talking about, the wackadoodle, because you whack that feeling from the liquid meat nacho soda combination, you whack it with some Nexium, and then you have side effects of the Nexium, and you have to whack that with something else, and then you're whacking the side effects. And when I have patients come into my office, I have them bring all the drugs with them. I say, I want to actually see what you're taking. Sometimes they're taking 3 versions of the same drug. They're taking Nexium, Acifex, and Prilosec. I'm like, this is all the same thing. One doctor gave them, another doctor. So they're taking multiple drugs. And then we get into, why are you taking this? Well, I'm taking this because when I started this, I wasn't sleeping. So then it's crazy. And I'm like, just stop taking the thing. But it's not our culture. Our culture is a pill for every ill. Nail number 3, by the way, when you talked about, you made those 3 really excellent points. The third one was about the immune system and susceptibility. Why are we so susceptible? So when I ask people, why do you think that some people get exposed to COVID, never actually even get infected? Others are asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, and others tragically end up in the ICU or even dead. Why do you think that is? Is that random? And, there's some obvious things, right? Some people have obesity, some people have a lot of heart and lung disease and all of these things. But even beyond that, there are additional risk factors, and sometimes these risk factors are hidden. Sometimes these risk factors are you don't have any stomach acid. Sometimes these risk factors are you're taking so many antibiotics, you barely have any helpful microbes left to fight the virus. And so you can't always tell from the outside. But really, one of the most compelling pieces of data was a study that came out last year that showed that looking at the composition of the gut microbiome, Shawn, is 92% accurate in predicting outcome from COVID. 92%. That's more accurate than age, comorbidities like obesity, hypertension, heart disease combined. It's more accurate than looking at inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, looking at the microbiome, and specifically looking at levels of 2 bacteria. The first is a bacteria called Enterococcus fecalis, which is, I hate to characterize bacteria as good or bad, but this isn't a particularly great one to have high levels of, because high levels are associated with poor outcome. This is a bacteria that can cross that gut lining, enter the bloodstream, wreak havoc, and it can allow COVID to do that. And the second bacteria is called Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, F. prausnitzii. It's my favorite bacteria of all time because it protects you against so many things, against heart disease, against stroke, against colon cancer. And it turns out it protects you against COVID. So people with high levels of F. prausnitzii, the good guy, good gal, have much better outcomes with COVID. So again, this is not random. This is not luck. Sometimes it is, but rarely. We can follow those breadcrumbs back. But here's the thing again, you can't just go borrow some of your friend's F. prausnitzii or take the supplement for the short-chain fatty acids, those important metabolites of microbes that the F. prausnitzii is producing that's keeping your immune system nice and Goldilocks, just right. You have to actually eat the food that the F. prausnitzii needs to thrive and to grow and to have a healthy population. And so, people spend so much time trying to figure out, how do I hack this? How do I get a supplement or borrow some stool or, just eat the food. Just eat a little more fiber. It will make a tremendous difference. So, the relationships can be complex. That whole, when you think about, you have the gut and you have the trillions of microbes on one side and you have this one cell layer thick like razor thin, and then you have all the immune cells on the other side, and they're in constant communication, right? So if your gut microbes aren't healthy and you don't have enough of the F. prosnitzii, the immune response is either going to be too active, where you end up with cytokine storm, you damage your lungs, you damage your body, or it's not going to be active enough and you don't clear the virus. So again, what creates that just right immune response? It's the F. prosnitzii churning out high levels of these short-chain fatty acids, the butyric acid, the propionic acid. But again, you have to feed them. You have to fuel them the right stuff.
Yeah. So that's another, again, because we have this pill for every ill consciousness, we're trying to look for, can I get that in a supplement? Is there some type of probiotic I could take to get that? Versus what you're saying is we need to provide the prebiotic fuel. So what would that look like? You said fiber was the key word here.
So, first of all, let me say there are no bad vegetables. They're all good. I mean, there are bad ways to prepare them. You just oversalt them, overfry them, etc. But what we're talking about here, particularly, Shawn, are something called MACs, MACs, microbiota accessible carbohydrates. And so that's primarily things like beans, legumes, oats, fibrous vegetables like celery, asparagus, broccoli, especially the stems. These are all prebiotic foods. Apples, these high fiber, kind of stringy fiber, if you will. I mean, leafy greens are good too, but it's really, think about the fiber that's dense, like celery or an asparagus stem, that kind of dense fiber. And, a lot of whole grains, a lot of legumes are also very prebiotic. So when you eat a lot of these foods, you're feeding the bacteria. And one of the most important studies we have validating this comes through the American Gut Project, that study in 2018. Again, a large population-based study. They looked at thousands of people, and they found that regardless of how you label yourself, regardless of whether you're vegan or an omnivore or, pescatarian, vegetarian, people who ate 30 or more different plant foods per week had vastly superior microbiomes to people who ate less than 10. And remember, we're talking variety. So I have plenty of patients who are like, oh yeah, I eat vegetables every lunch and dinner, but they eat the same peas, carrots, and broccoli every day. So they're getting 3 versus the 30. And, it's per week. So when you think about it, if you take something like a bowl of oatmeal, you have the oats, maybe you make it with some almond milk, that's 2. You put some walnuts in it, 3. You put some blueberries in it, 4. You put some pumpkin seeds in it, 5. Maybe you sprinkle a little grated coconut, 6. You add some bananas, 7. You have 7 plant foods in your bowl of oatmeal. You have a salad with lettuce, tomato, cucumber. That's 10. That's 10 already, and you haven't even got to dinner. For dinner, you steam a little broccoli and you have some avocado. You're at 12. You only need to get to 30. I mean, the higher the better, of course. So it's really thinking about the variety. You want to get out of this monoculture of eating the same vegetables every day, get into eating seasonally, getting to eating a variety. Because again, all these prebiotic foods, they all have different substances in them, but they all feed the bacteria. The bacteria churn out the short-chain fatty acids. The short-chain fatty acids guide that immune response. They tell those immune cells, those B and T cells and plasma cells, exactly how many cytokines to make, what kind of cytokine. Because, as you know, Shawn, the majority of deaths from COVID are not from the virus specifically. They're from the immune response. They're from an exaggerated immune response. It's our bodies are destroying our own tissue, creating inflammation in the lungs and in the heart and in the brain. So you need those short-chain fatty acids to modulate, to kind of draw that response back a little bit, so that you don't damage tissue, but you still clear the virus. And, you can look at immunology textbooks and you see all kinds of complicated things, but at the end of the day, it is that simple. And of course, don't do things that damage a gut lining, like taking a lot of NSAIDs, for example, because that's going to damage a gut lining, make it easier for COVID to get across.
Yes, we got to come back and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But just to lean into this a little bit more, because what you just said about the diversity, and I've seen this consistently in my almost 20 years in this field, even when we're eating, quote, healthy, eating real whole foods, we tend to get in a rut of cycling and recycling those same foods over and over again. So somebody might be eating, salmon and sweet potato and broccoli, and then they'll do their food prep, and they're just eating that over and over again. Especially in the fitness field, it'll be chicken, rice, broccoli, chicken, rice, broccoli, chicken, rice, asparagus, chicken, potato, broccoli, like it'll be some minor tweaks, but it's a lot of these same types of foods, these solo foods, which you just brought up. A really easy thing that we can do is just stack it when we have a meal, right? So that oatmeal can become something very evolved, where we have some chia seeds in there, where we have the fruit in there, where we have some nut butter, or whatever the case might be. Or I'm really big into making these acai bowls right now. So, and this is going to go, I've got something planned for that, but it's a great opportunity for me to stack it, right? So I have the acai, I have the berries, I have the nut butter, I have chia and flax and protein, various types of protein that I could add. The list goes on, things you could do. So start stacking your meals a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Last one you mentioned was the salad. Oh my gosh, what all the things you can do with the salad, even the different types of leaves that you're using, the lettuce leaves. So it can be arugula, it could be romaine, it could be spinach, and then all the wonderful array of veggies and fruits.
Yeah, and think about the consistency too. What are you going to add for crunch? Are you going to add some kind of seeds for crunch? Or, are you going to add in maybe some toasted chickpeas, roasted chickpeas? So think about the texture too that you want. What do you want that's smoother? Something like avocado, but what do you want for crunch? What do you want? Do you want some tartness? Do you want some sweet? I love throwing some fruit in. And again, shopping seasonally at the farmer's market. One of the things I challenge my patients to do is I say, every week I want you to go to the farmer's market and I want you to buy a new type of produce that you've never had before. It could be a radish. It could be rutabaga. It could be dandelion root. Talk to the farmer, get some suggestions. They know, they grow it. They know what to do with it, and come home and make something you've never made before.
Yeah, such great advice. So to go back, you brought up NSAIDs, and the consumption has skyrocketed in recent years of NSAIDs. So these are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications. And most often, of course, people are associating this with treating pain. And we're experiencing another hidden epidemic that shouldn't be hidden of pain and pain management. And oftentimes, again, these are a result of things that we're doing in our lives that are manifesting this pain. So we're not treating the symptom. We're not treating the root cause, but treating symptoms with these NSAIDs. But here's a little sobering statistic. A recent report estimates the United States NSAID market is going to reach $25 billion industry within the next 5 years. $25 billion.
I saw that study.
Crazy.
I think we're currently at 17.8 billion or something crazy. Yeah, I saw that number and I was shocked. And I think part of what's happened is that people have gotten more aware of opiates, which is great. We want people to be aware, but people have now turned more to NSAIDs because, they perceive them as a safer option. And in many ways they are, but they're still super dangerous as far as the gut and all of that. And, the other thing, Shawn, when I met my husband about 23 years ago or so, he's an athlete, he works out. He used to take some kind of ibuprofen, Motrin, Advil, Aleve, Anacin, whatever, an NSAID, virtually every day. He would say he had a sinus headache or he had an ache or pain. And I said to him one day, I said, you realize that every time I go into the hospital on call, virtually every weekend I'm on call, I am scoping somebody with a GI bleed from those drugs. He was shocked. But GI bleeding from NSAIDs is still one of the most common reasons for somebody to end up in the emergency room. And fatal bleeding a lot of the time. So those little erosions and ulcers that's one of the absorption of the drugs to work systemically erodes through that mucus lining of the GI tract. And it can cause just tiny little kind of pinpoint erosions, but it can cause bigger ulcers. And if that ulcer happens to be in your stomach or duodenum, your small intestine, over an area where a significant blood vessel is running, you might be just out of luck. Because if you're hitting a big vessel like the gastroduodenal artery, and that thing starts pumping, that's a situation where we fly in there, put the scope down, there's blood everywhere. We're just trying to tamponade to stop that bleeding. And many people don't make it from something as simple as taking one of these drugs. So these drugs, again, they're amongst the most commonly prescribed in the world because they work. I remember I tore my MCL snowboarding back in 2017 in Utah, and this thing was painful. First run of my first day out, Friday the 13th, I'd flown all the way from DC, was there for a conference, got there Friday afternoon, fresh powder. I was actually at Powder Mountain, Utah, and I'm like, oh man, I got to get a quick run in. And my husband and daughter were with me. My husband's a boarder too. My daughter's a skier. And we're getting off the lift, Shawn. And there's a downed skier right in front of me. So I just kind of politely go around. But I go around and my knee turns and my board doesn't turn. So I wrench my knee. And my husband and my daughter are like, come on, let's go. Like, it's a big deal. You're fine. So I somehow painfully, slowly make it down on our first run. And I'm like, man, something's wrong. And sure enough, it was a torn MCL. But I had to get home. So I got a pair of crutches. I was the rest of the weekend on crutches while they had a fantastic time up and down the mountain. And I'm coming home and I'm like, I can't bend my knee to sit in the plane. So I get a bunch of NSAIDs, and I'll tell you, it was like magic. My pain was gone. I said, oh no, something that works this well cannot possibly be good for you. I don't take these drugs. I'll typically take them, once every blue moon, every decade with some extreme circumstance like this thing with my knee. And I tell you, I was immediately suspicious. Like, how can this possibly be a good idea if my pain is gone like that? I must be paying a price somewhere else. So, the drugs are really effective. And while there are people who are in pain because they're, doing things they shouldn't be doing, like they're sitting too much or whatever, things happen sometimes, like my knee injury. But it's really the chronic use that's the problem. And these drugs really, they poke holes in that gut lining. And your gut lining, we're talking about immune system and defense. Your gut lining is the main thing keeping what's inside your body away from the environment. Because when you eat food, it's in your digestive tract, which really means it's not in your body. It's in this hollow tunnel that goes from mouth to tush. And in that tunnel is really the environment. It's air and toxins and food and bacteria and viruses. And one of the gut lining's purposes, in addition to allowing the nutrients to be absorbed through so that your body can use them for food, it's also to keep pathogens out. So if you now have all these holes in the lining, stuff is coming through, including viruses like COVID. And COVID is now getting into your body. Their receptors are ACE2 receptors in the heart, the lungs, the kidney, the liver, other organs, where the virus can now bind and do damage. So again, I just really want people to think about, what does it really mean when you're taking these drugs that work so well? You're getting relief, you feel great. Think about where you may be paying the price, down the line.
Yeah, if anybody can think back into their mental Rolodex over the last 2 years, how many times did you see a so-called public health official on TV talking about gut health in relationship to this virus that's taken over everybody's life? I can't think of a single time.
Never.
Of course not. Like, again, but for me, I really thought that in the beginning of this, like, this is our Super Bowl, this is our opportunity to apply the things that we've learned over the past few decades, all the mountains of research we have into these different fields. And to see us again revert so far back and ignore the foundational principles of how all this stuff works was really, really fishy for me. And so again, looking at this issue with NSAIDs, and so this is an urge for everybody to be cautious. We talked about the caution required with antibiotics. We need to be cautious in these situations, not to say that they work, like you just said. It's like, it's amazing how they work, but we're tricking our body. There's an underlying issue happening, but we're tricking our body. Okay, in a spot situation, absolutely. But if we're consistently leaning on these things, we are tearing our bodies apart from the inside out.
You're so right, Shawn. And it's an interesting position for me as a physician. And I've been a physician for 30 years, 31 this year, to spend the majority of my time trying to help people unprescribe, trying to get off of these drugs, and realizing that we, in a well-meaning way, we're trying to help people, but we in the medical community are also creating a lot of these problems because we are overprescribing. We are overdiagnosing, we're overprescribing, and while a lot of these drugs are used appropriately, I mean, I'm glad the pharmaceutical industry exists, and I'm glad that we have powerful, effective drugs, but we are not using them judiciously. And so really what I want consumers to know is that they have to be really strong advocates. I give you an example. One of my favorite studies, Shawn, it's a study from several years ago from the journal Pediatrics. And this study showed that pediatricians prescribe antibiotics 62% of the time when they perceive that the parent wants an antibiotic for their kid, and only 7% when they don't. So that tells us there's an enormous gray zone area where the drug is just not necessary, right? It's totally dealer's choice. So, I want people to be the kind of patient who walks in with one eyebrow raised, like, do I really need that? Ask questions, probe, ask about options, alternatives. I mean, most physicians are well-meaning, but they're busy, they don't have time, they may not be as well-informed as you think they are, or they may just think you want a drug, because lots of people walk in and they want something, and they're trying to make you happy. So you really have to be, one of those consumers who's a little skeptical and questions things, because I tell you, there's a lot of gray zone there.
Yeah. Man, it's so powerful. So I want to go back just a little bit and talk about this association because I don't think that we think these are two entirely different universes, but you brought forth this understanding, this principle that our bacteria, a healthy gut bacteria cascade, is necessary in order to protect us from viruses. So it's kind of like bacteria versus viruses in my mind. So I thought of like a video game screen, you got this side like Mortal Kombat, but they're all intermingling. You have the human virome. Like right now, everybody listening, we've got like 400 trillion virus particles in and on our bodies. And the best theory that is taught in university settings of how the human immune system evolved, it evolved from viruses integrating with what we consider our human blueprint, right? So viruses facing off against other viruses, right? But bacteria also are necessary, the right cascade of bacteria, as you've been talking about, to help us to defend our bodies from viruses.
I love that you bring up the virome, because it's a term that even in the medical community, until really a few years ago, people weren't really familiar with. And those numbers, so we have about maybe 100 trillion. I mean, nobody really knows, but we have roughly 10 times the number of microbial cells compared to human cells. And then we have about 100 times the number of viral particles compared to bacterial organisms. We have, one estimate is that there are more viruses in our body than there are stars in the universe. It's a lot. That's a lot. I watch enough Neil deGrasse Tyson to know that's a lot. And as you said, as much as 10% of our genome of human genetic material is actually derived from viruses. And just like bacteria can protect us from other bacteria, and they protect us from viruses from other organisms. So not all viruses are bad. And in fact, the role that viruses play in the universe in terms of, for example, killing pathogenic bacteria in the water that can protect the plankton, that's involved in photosynthesis to keep our, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen balance. If all viruses disappear, the estimate is that life on Earth would cease after about a day and a half. So, the majority of viruses, just like the majority of bacteria, are not out to get us. And they're part of our genetic material, and they're part of our microbiome in a larger sense. But what allows our immune system to be able to detect from the trillions of organisms it's seeing coming through the gut every day, right? What allows it to know precisely this is a pathogen versus this is just a commensal, not to react to it? And again, it's those healthy microbes that guide it. Those are like the sages for the immune system that literally say to the immune system, okay, this one, big immune response, right? Ebola is up in the house. You need to be really worried and do something big versus, oh yeah, this is nothing. Just keep going. Ignore this. So to really modulate that immune response, it really is the bacteria that are doing all the work there, that are guiding that. And what's really interesting about viruses too, I learned a lot writing this last book, was so interesting. And for example, certain classes of herpes virus are protective against bubonic plague. And certain types of viruses too can slow down progression of HIV. So some people who are infected with HIV, based on other viruses in their body, they'll never progress to AIDS.
Wow.
Certain people are immune to HIV, no matter how many times they're exposed. About 10% of people with certain European ancestry. And we think in part because those were genes that protected them from bubonic plague way back in the day, and they're now protecting them against HIV. So, the interaction with all of this, which is why we can't just apply a scorched earth approach and we're just going to burn it all down. We're going to get rid of all the organisms. You would die. You need this stuff to keep you alive, to guide your immune system, to make hormones, to detoxify compounds, to activate genes. So we have to have a more measured approach. And I think about it like gardening, Shawn. I'm not much of a gardener. I don't have a green thumb at all, but I love plants. But what I do know is that if you are too aggressive with the gardening and you're using like heavy duty pesticides, sure, you'll get rid of the giant hogweed and the poison ivy, you'll get rid of the weeds, but you're not going to grow anything good in that garden either, because the soil is going to be too polluted from the pesticides. It's going to be overkill. And it's the same thing when I think about the gut and I talk to people about the gut garden. If you are on a search and destroy mission, with your antibiotics and your antifungals and your antivirals and you're, trying to kill everything in there, you are also going to harm your gut, your soil, your gut soil that everything grows from. That's, again, the engine feeding your brain and your lungs and your kidneys is going to be damaged. So I really focus on a repopulation approach. How can you increase the population of the good guys, the Faecalibacterium prosnitzii, by eating more healthy fiber, build up that acai bowl and that salad, right? Crowd out the bad guys. And, I've seen it over the last few decades in my medical practice where we treat people with complicated autoimmune diseases, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, autoimmune hepatitis. And by really changing what's going on in their gut, we can make a tremendous difference with their disease. And the same thing for how we should really be thinking of, our antiviral approach. It's great that we have this potent stuff for when people really need it. But the everyday approach is to strengthen your host defenses by really thinking about what's going on in your gut. What can you remove? The NSAIDs, the acid blockers, the antibiotics, and what can you use to restore the health of your gut? And that's primarily food. As I like to say, dirt, sweat, veg. You got to get out in nature. You got to get your sweat on. You got to eat some vegetables. It's really that simple.
The word that jumped out, there's so much there, modulate. So our bacteria are immunomodulators. And so for us to have an appropriate immune response, and that's another thing that I don't think has been part of the education for the public, is that it's your immune system. We want to have an appropriate response when you come in contact with this virus or anything else, because like we've seen with COVID, it's inevitable that you're going to come in contact. So you want your body to have an appropriate response. And so bacteria are behind the scenes functioning as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, immunomodulator. And so putting focus here is about real solutions. And so I want to talk about, so we've mentioned bringing in diversity of different plants, which is a huge hallmark takeaway from today. We've seen this, and I've got data on this that I talked about in my latest book, In Eat Smarter. We see as the diversity of your microbes goes down, obesity goes up. As the diversity of your microbes go down, diabetes goes up, heart disease goes up. Pretty much the top 10 killers and more, all of these chronic conditions go up, your rates of these things, as your diversity goes down. So increasing diversity, the number one way to do that is increase the diversity of foods that you're eating. Of
what you're eating.
Real whole foods. So very, very simple principle.
And I just want to mention too, because you mentioned eat smarter, but also thinking about sleep smarter. We know also that Tryptophan, the amino acid tryptophan, is a precursor for serotonin, the feel-good hormone that's primarily made in your gut, 80 to 90% of it. And serotonin is a precursor for melatonin, the hormone that you need to help you fall asleep. So if your gut microbes are off kilter, if you don't have good diversity, you're going to have low serotonin, it's going to affect your mood, and you're going to have low melatonin, and it's going to affect your sleep. And not sleeping is going to make you, as you know more than anybody, very susceptible to viruses. There was a study published in the British Medical Journal recently that showed that people who are chronically sleep deprived have an 88% higher risk of coming down with a virus. And for every hour of sleep you get, your risk decreases 12%. So the sleep susceptibility thing is really key. And again, it ties back to what's going on in your gut.
You're the best. We did a masterclass really talking about the sleep connection with COVID, and I mentioned that specific study. Another thing, there's multiple studies on this as well, looking at melatonin and its interaction as even a treatment, being used as a treatment for reducing symptoms of COVID and transmissibility and all those things. And there's a lot of efficacy there too. But your body can make it. Your body, that's what we want to do. We want to stack conditions. Exactly. And so speaking of creating more robust health, reducing our susceptibility, there's a specific phenomenon in our culture. It's a certain category of food. And not only does this tie back to the need for NSAIDs because it's so pro-inflammatory, right? So NSAIDs are trying to reduce inflammation or address those signals, but something that's a big driver of inflammation, but also a big driver of susceptibility to viruses, to damaging our gut health, is sugar. So let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the craziest things, so, I just spoke at this event, and, you see, when you go to these events, you see the barrage of like snacks for people. It's all these different types of muffins and cookies and sodas. They had all these sodas, and then sodas that you only see in other countries. We don't really see the like Shasta.
Yeah,
here,
like
you know what I mean?
60 grams of high fructose corn syrup.
Crazy stuff, right? And so this is what the array of options are if you want to grab a snack while you're at the conference, right? And it's just for me, even when I was on stage, I'm just like, we're still drinking soda? Like, are we actually still doing this?
We need to check out the physician's lounge at the hospital.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm always like, I'm going to do a Washington Post expose. Why is this here? Why do we, Neil Barnard, who runs the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which is a great organization, they push they have a plant-focused agenda, but he has a petition going around amongst physicians. I just have to give him a little shout out because the petition is very simple. We are asking that hospitals not serve known carcinogens to patients. Bacon, sausage, known carcinogens. Like, if you want to eat that on your own time at home and you know the risk, fine. But as a hospital, the World Health Organization says these things are known carcinogens, containing nitrates, etc. And we are serving them to patients in the hospital. Soda, right up there with probably, if you had to ask me, like, what's the worst thing you can consume on a regular basis, it's soda. So beyond the calories, right? And the calorie thing, like, we're dealing with major obesity epidemics, not just here, but in the developing world. Where I come from in Jamaica, the rise in obesity we've seen, the dramatic rise in the last decade or so, is almost entirely due to these sugary drinks. And so if you think about an average soda, 150 calories, times 365 days, 54,500 calories, divided by 3,500 calories is a pound, it's about 15.7 pounds in a year, just from having a soda a day. And my math may have been off by half a pound or so, but it's somewhere around 15 or 16 pounds in a year, just from a soda a day, if you do nothing differently. And if you think, okay, well, I'm doing diet soda, even worse, because the artificial sweeteners mess up your microbiome. They turn regular, healthy, nice, friendly, helpful bacteria into pathogens. They're harmful to the gut lining. And it turns out that insulin, the hormone that, of course, causes all these calories to be stored as fat, insulin is released in response to sweetness, not sugar. So diet sodas still cause that insulin surge. They're as big a risk factor for diabetes, if not bigger. I mean, it shocks me that doctors recommend diet products for patients. I'm like, Have you not read any of the literature in the last 10 years showing that these artificial sweeteners are detrimental to the gut? They still cause weight gain. So if you're drinking a diet soda and you're seeing 0 calories experimentally, but the same surge of insulin, if not bigger, the same weight gain, in addition to the fact that the chemicals and the high fructose corn syrup, terrible for your microbiome, feed the wrong species, you get imbalance, you get overgrowth of a lot of the pathogenic species. The sugar thing is tough though. We've seen sugar and alcohol during the pandemic. People have been scared, people have been anxious, people have been in terrible circumstances where they've lost their livelihood, they've lost loved ones. And so they turn to things that are comforting. And those things are often alcohol and sugar. And, as you know, Shawn, they're also addictive, right? Because you get that dopamine, those dopamine receptors in the brain being triggered. And, there are lots of studies that show that the sugar high is as powerful as an opiate high in some people. So it's really a problem. But yeah, at a health conference, as I said, in the physician's lounge in pretty much every hospital in America, you're going to find soda, you're going to find donuts, you're going to find Cheetos. And, if we can't feed ourselves properly as practitioners, how are we expected to take care of the patients? And I think what it speaks to is the idea of, are we really promoting health, or are we creating a market for, our medical industrial complex?
Right. Just feeding right into itself. Yeah. So one of the things that you just mentioned is so powerful, by the way, but just looking at this so-called artificial sweetener phenomenon and these quote diet products. So first of all, if we're slapping that label on there, you should be very suspicious. It's marketing. But there are really well-meaning physicians out there who are in cases they're getting results for people. Maybe it's through weight loss with them utilizing artificial sweeteners, diet products and the like, but they're missing out on some very key science because again, we can get this tunnel vision.
Yeah.
And one of those, here's just a logical piece. We're utilizing these artificial compounds that have never been used before for human beings in our entire evolution. First of all, it should have a little red flag come up. We don't have any biological association with this newly invented synthetic compound, right? So automatically, and also what it's doing, again, is one of those things where we're tricking your body, trying to trick your body. And even that is very ignorant because it's like stupid human brain with all your magnificent capabilities. We're going to trick you here with this, calorie-free sweetener, but not understanding. We'll put this study up for people to see as well. We see a significant increase in dementia with folks that are utilizing these artificial sweeteners. And what's going on here? We're looking at the impact that it likely has on our nervous system. More data needs to be done, but also on the other side, if you're advocating for people to have these artificial sweeteners, we need way more data than what people are advocating, these little spot studies. And, maybe it's just geared towards weight loss, for example. Sure, I get it. But what are you doing to the person's overall metabolic health, their microbiome, their hormone function, their nervous system? The list goes on and on. These things don't come without a cost. It's not real. It's literally called artificial.
You can't hack it. I tell people all the time, you cannot cheat Mother Nature, right? You're going to pay somewhere. If you're not paying here, you're going to pay somewhere else. So, I'm so glad you mentioned the issue about the contribution to dementia. And it's something I think about a lot. I have a strong family history of Alzheimer's, and realizing that dementia, and Alzheimer's even more specifically, is multifactorial. I remind people that in the 13 years of the Human Genome Project, from 1990 to 2003, which was a bulk of the Human Genome Project, but we didn't finish mapping the entire 100% of the human genome until January of this year. January 2022, there was some missing information on the Y chromosome. So now we have 100% of the human genome, and it took from 1990. Okay, so it took 32 years, cost somewhere around $3 billion, over 50 institutions. And how many genetic diseases do you think we have cured? Zero. Because the genes are often just a suggestion. This idea of, it's your genes. Your genes can play a role, but it is the environmental influence. It is nature and nurture. Nature are the genes, what you inherit. that are fairly static. There's some movement with genes. They can be turned on or off, but they're more static. But it's the nurture, how we live, what we do, the foods we eat, the activities, the environments, even the thoughts that we think, and certainly the medications that we take that ultimately determine our health. And so when we look at something like dementia, and we look at the rising rates, I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't know anybody who had a grandparent with Alzheimer's. Now I don't know anybody who doesn't. It's crazy. It's like cancer. You know, I know fewer people who have not had cancer than who have had. And maybe that's because I'm a physician, so a lot of the people I know are in the medical system. But the point is, it's multifactorial. And we know that all these drugs that affect your brain, if you look at antihistamines, anything that's going to affect your state of consciousness, make you hyper or make you drowsy. So you look at things like benzodiazepines, you know, like the Valium and the Ativan, and you look at the drugs that our kids are being given, or kids are being medicated with these heavy-duty psychotropic drugs. These are all things that ultimately can contribute. So if you take somebody who already has a genetic predisposition, who's on multiple drugs that can affect this, who's eating a crummy diet with few prebiotic foods, who's eating food with artificial sweeteners, and you start to see how this stuff develops. You know, you follow the breadcrumbs. But the cool thing is you can follow those breadcrumbs backwards too, and you can start to figure out what are the risk factors, what are the things that are propelling me towards disease, and how do I step off that road, right? And Shawn, honestly, you know, from the bottom of my heart here, this is why programs like yours work like what you do, which is incredibly well researched and scientifically backed, and really only has one goal, which is to empower people, is so important. Because the sad truth is, and I'm second generation physician, my dad's a surgeon, my brother's a surgeon. I'm proud to be a doctor, but at the same time, I'm also incredibly disappointed in the medical system that we're not doing the kind of advocacy for our patients that we need to do. And we're way too influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, by the medical device industry. And we have got to get back to the basic idea of who we work for, and we work for the patients. So anyway, all of that to say kudos to you, power to the people. Let's keep this information coming for sure.
Yes. Dr. Chutkan, I got chills. Thank you so much for sharing your voice and your perspective and your experience and your tools. You're one of the best. And you've got a myriad of amazing books that people can check out. And you've got a new book coming, which we're going to have you back on it to dive into that one, of course. It's going to blow everybody's mind. And also, so I want people to be aware, as of this recording, within the next week or two, you're going to be dropping a podcast.
Yes.
A brand new podcast. And I think everybody's already picked up the vibe that you're somebody to listen to and to hang out with. So can you let everybody know the podcast name to have an eye out for, and also just where they can follow you right now to stay connected?
Absolutely. So it's the original name, the Gut Bliss Podcast. You can find us on gutbliss.com, GUTBLISS. You can see there's a consistent theme here of gut bliss. And again, we get down and gritty. We get into it in the podcast. And, we'd love to hear from you. I'm so excited about it. I've been encouraged by people like you, Shawn, and you saying, just do it, just put it out there. And, we're always interested in what people think. So check us out at gutbliss.com, and Instagram is @gutbliss, and the podcast will be out in a week or two.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
The power that exists within the gut is insane. And this is why it becomes so important for us to, first of all, learn about it and use that information that we learn to empower ourselves.